All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the most exciting session of the day, regulatory. It's it's lovely to see so many people here, and we really appreciate you sticking around for the afternoon session here. We've got a great series of talks on a number of initiatives, and we'll just kick it right off here. So starting off, I'm Andrew Karn, VP of the Chamber of Mines, and I'll be emceeing this afternoon session. The first session that we have is a panel on environmental and socioeconomic assessment, achieving a balance. And I will introduce Steve Morrison, the managing principal of SRM Consulting, and he's going to kick things off with a brief presentation, and he'll introduce the rest of the panel. So, Steve.
Thanks, Andrew. Boy, talk about motivational regulatory. Very, very motivating. Thanks for coming this afternoon, and we got a great panel for you. How do I do this now? There you go. So the agenda for the next 40 minutes will be, the panelists will introduce themselves to you. We have designed a bunch of questions ahead of time. Everybody's got them, and we'll be going around, and I'll be asking them questions, and they'll be responding. And then questions from the audience, and I'm going to summarize what I've heard. My computer's going here. I'm going to take a few notes as we go through it, and I'll give you a bit of summary at the end. So next thing we'll do is we'll get the panelists to introduce themselves. Start with Pam.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending. Pamela O'Hara. I'm a director at the Yukon Chamber of Mines and also VP of Sustainability for Fireweed Metals.
She's losing her voice, too.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kent Retzlaff. I'm the executive director at Geoscience.
Hi, I'm Will Fellers. I'm the president of the Klondike Placer Miners Association and a third-generation placer miner from Dawson City.
So we've got a pretty wide range of panelists, so we'll have some good dialogue this afternoon. I thought to kick things off, it'd be really not a bad idea to talk about environmental assessment or an assessment at 50,000 feet. And just to set a bit of context around the questions as well. And I'm going to start with the UFA, the Umbrella Final Agreement. That's where you start. And if you look at the UFA, if you haven't looked at it a long time, it's really interesting reading Chapter 12, the development assessment process. I was involved in negotiations with that actually back in the day. And it's interesting with some of the clauses in the development assessment process, that's the precursor to YESA, where, how does this thing work now? Where it talks about protecting and maintaining environmental quality and ensures that projects are undertaken consistent with the principles of sustainable development. That's good. Protects and maintains heritage resources. That's good. Provides for a comprehensive and timely review of the environmental and socio-economic effects of any project before the approval of the project. That's good too. Avoids duplication in the review process for projects, and to the greatest extent practical, provides certainty to all affected parties and project proponents with respect to procedures, information requirements, time requirements, and costs. And the last point that I'm in this slide requires project proponents to consider the environmental and socioeconomic effects of the project and project's alternatives. Anyway, these are good principles. So those principles are in the UFA, which leads to the purpose of the Act. YESA is federal legislation. Just, again, this is at 50,000 feet. It's federal legislation. And many of the principles that were in the UFA follow through in the purpose of the Act itself. So there's follow through. So at a high level, that's an important point. How does YESA work, or YESA work? You identify the project scope. This is very general, project scope. You identify the activities that are going to be assessed. Then the assessment itself is scoped with VSECs, which are valued environmental socioeconomic components, right? Through baseline conditions and boundaries, you determine the significance and you recommend. YESUB can recommend, there's 3 or 4 different types of recommendations, significant adverse effects that can't be mitigated, that can be mitigated, things like that. Very simple process. I look at environmental assessment this way. Environmental assessment is really a prediction process. You're making predictions based on the information you have at hand. You're making predictions about effects based on the information you have at hand that the proponent has supplied, that interveners have supplied through the process. It's really a predictive exercise. That's how I've always looked at it. So, with that very short, high-level overview EA, keep that stuff in mind as we go through this. So are you going to turn the presentation off now and go to the cameras, or what's the deal? Okay. Sorry. It was a long night last night. Jesus, my throat's killing me. So we have 5 questions, and I'm just going to go through them. As I said, take notes, and then we'll open the floor when we have time. We've got another 35 minutes. There's a huge clock here, but this is big. So first question, what in your view constitutes a balanced approach to assessment practices and procedures, and what keywords, ideas, or themes summarizes this? So what in your view is a balanced approach? We've got a perspective of the course industry, YESA, and the plaster industry. So we'll start with Pam.
Thanks, Steve, and I think you're in good shape compared to some others I know.
Like you.
No, not me. No, not me. A balanced approach. You know, I thought about this in the context of your question, and you know, if you can say one word about it, it's certainty. And I think there's 3 elements to that. You know, it's clarity and process, it's cost certainty, and I mean, there's an element here that we all have to know what we're going into, and we all have to know what's coming out of it. And when there's changing goalposts or uncertainty going into a process, you can't assume that it's going to be balanced. And I think, you know, capacity limitations across the industry, both with assessors and proponents, once you get into the YESA process, is a key factor as well. You know, time is precious. A lot of us have attended many talks over the last couple of days, which have emphasized the fact that, you know, we need process certainty. And so I think just reflecting on one word, I'll stand behind that one.
It's a good word. Can everybody hear it back okay? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Steve, for bringing it up to the 10,000-foot level, because as an organization, yes, we have a lot to balance. And if we're getting into the details, I'd keep you all here for about 10 hours. But yeah, at the top tier of it, we want to have a process that is balanced, predictable, but also current. Its best practices are changing by the moment, by the day, by the project. It's something we can't ignore as an organization, but we have to be able to adapt to them in a way that everyone else understands and can keep up, in the sense that they can know what's coming to them. So I think that's the biggest balance at the end of the day for us, is to keep current, to keep doing the best work that our staff wants to do, the work that they were educated in and they prioritize, but then make sure that it's Yukon specific, it's project specific at the end of the day.
So as we go through these questions, when things come up, I'm going to ask another question as we go around. So you said that best practices are evolving. Do you think the bar is continually rising, or is that what you're referring to in terms of best practices?
I think the bar is continually moving, and depends on the person if it's rising or falling.
So it's hard to track.
It's hard to track, but the fact that it is moving day to day, month to month, year to year.
And to be fair to Kent, that's a big challenge in an organization. Things you did a few years ago, recommendations or assessment techniques may not be appropriate 2 years from now. So it's tough on an organization as well. Mr. Plasterminer.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I'm a little nervous here, so I've never done one of these. But yeah, I think a balanced approach when it reflects to the plaster industry is one that's it's transparent and fair. And it looks at all sides of the story that's put towards the assessors, from the proponent and from the interveners. One of the things that I feel is missing in a balanced approach is looking at positive effects. We don't seem to allow that to go into the assessment process, and I think it's one that would help to balance it and make it more fair. So I think transparency, a fair assessment, and consistency with the the conditions and terms coming out of them is one too that in the industry, plaster industry, we're a small industry, so the moving goalposts are really hard for us to keep up to.
So with positive effects, you're thinking mainly the economic effects for employment and vendors and supplies and that kind of thing,
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
Okay, and in terms of consistency, you're talking about how things operate across the territory to mine to mine to mine and how they're assessed at DOs, and that's what you're talking about in terms of consistency, right?
Exactly, yeah. So we can have assessments done in through different DOs with the same kind of same project being put forward, and they'll have a wide range of differences when the terms and conditions come out, depending on which office. So there isn't a real consistency between DOs.
Okay. Kent, do you want to react to that at all?
No, it's nothing I haven't heard before, and I will speak to it more the next question.
Okay. I want to have interaction here. Nobody's out to get anybody. It's just, the thing I'm finding most important of all these kinds of things, as I understand in the regulatory world, is communications is the key. Communicate, communicate, communicate. So that dialogue is part of the communications. So it's not up to get anybody or pin anybody down, but we got to talk. We got to talk more. We got to talk more effectively, more openly. We got to keep the communications going. Okay, next question. Yes, legislation received royal assent in 2003. That's mean it was law. What, in your view, should be the priorities for the assessment process with approximately 20 years of implementation experience, and are there important lessons learned? So we've got 20 years of experience, which makes you feel really old. And we've got 20 years of experience. What are the priorities going forward, and what lessons do you think we've learned from the 20 years? You're too young for it, but Pam?
I'm too young for it?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So complimentary. I love it. Yeah. I mean, EA is not easy, right? I think there's challenges at whatever level you look at this, minor projects to major mining projects. Across Canada, it is really rare that two EA practitioners will agree on how to do something. And I think that, if we are going to live with YESA as it is currently articulated, where the assessors are assessing likely adverse effects, we need to get back to looking at EA as a planning tool. It should be making projects better. The whole focus of EA should be on making projects better by getting input from those who are involved, all interveners, from whomever wants to participate, who has an inherent interest in the project or the area in which you want to work or you're proposing to work. It's not about every minute detail, every potential effect. We have to go back to looking at this as streamlining, and we hear this from the federal government, and we were just talking about this, how there's no way you can streamline regulatory processes because the burden is there. We have to prove and work through each individual effect. But there are those that really stand out that are most significant. And those are the effects we should be focused on first and foremost. There's inherent uncertainty in EA, and we have to be able to accept the fact that there will be risks. I completely agree that coming back to the territories after not being here, to the Yukon territory after not working here for almost a decade, I have been recently working under the federal system, and it was amazing for me to refresh my memory how you don't look at both the adverse and positive effects to come up with, the opportunities and the risks to come up with a conclusion about what this project is and how meaningful it might be to the territory. So there's a lot of opportunities for us, I think, to move forward as an industry as a whole, where we can showcase some of the benefits, still focus on looking at those likely adverse effects to ensure that we have appropriate mitigation in place to mitigate those.
Thanks, Pam. Ken.
Yeah, I won't comment on where I was in 2003, but my favorite thing in the territory working here is that everyone that was in those conversations is still here. and they're still at the meetings, they're still in the working groups, they're still in the projects, which makes it really cool for everyone involved, because we can continue to learn from each other and build on that. So we can build on the foundations that were negotiated back then. We can see what the last 20 years have done, and then we can move forward with priorities for each organization. YESUB itself, there's only 2 board priorities right now. One is First Nation relations. For a long time, I think across the territory, YESUB can be seen as a pretty big black box. We're trying to break out of that. We're trying to build relations with all parties and make sure First Nations really understand how we consider impacts to the exercise of their rights. Another angle of the priority, addressing organizational capacity. To your point, we're taking there's been lots of initiatives over the years of people working together, trying to figure out how to streamline things. We're taking pause and just looking inwards and seeing how we do things. We're taking our legislation, we're looking at our guidance, we're looking at our most proud recommendations to date, and seeing how all those mesh together or don't mesh together in the attempt to hopefully communicate just more clear guidance in the future.
Thanks, Kent. I should mention, Kent is really brave coming here today because he's the executive director. He's been in the job about a month.
Yeah, let's call it 2.
Huh?
Let's call it 2.
2 months. So, this is terrific. He's here. And what you've said really resonates with me in terms of improvements. And what Pam said also resonates with me is EA is not easy. If you've ever been involved in an EA, at the end of it, you're exhausted. You're not particularly happy because it's compromised all over the place. And you're just glad it's done. EA is really, really hard because it's predicting effects, putting in mitigation, monitoring all that stuff with thousands of pieces of paper, thousands and thousands of pages of data and paper. It's a hard slog. So if you're internal to the government or a proponent, it's hard for both parties. You both agree with that? Yeah. Well.
Yeah, I like to hear what Kent said about that, about how they're looking inside at their working systems too, and maybe looking at opportunities to streamline, and I think that's one of our suggestions for priorities, is trying to find out how to streamline some of the processes and working on timelines. In the plaster industry, again, I might sound like a broken record by the end of this, but timelines is a big issue for us, and the uncertainty on them and how it plays out during the assessment process. The plaster industry I think has proven over the 125 years that we are a fairly low risk industry. And it would be really good if we could work on, streamlining some of the, lower risk portions of that to try and speed up timelines. And again, that'll help with capacity and stuff like that in the end too, so.
Thanks. That's good comments. Thank you. Okay, next question. How would you characterize the main issues associated with assessment in Yukon? So again, how would you characterize the main issues from your perspective that are involved with the assessment process in Yukon? What are the main issues?
I think, again, it goes back to what you're saying about expectations and clear guidance, and how are we going to modernize where we're trying to go with this. And we're living in a changing landscape, and the talk earlier today on economic reconciliation, where is that factored in? And I think that there's movement here where we can have a much more comprehensive system within YESUB to look at project reviews. There's many things I could say on this, but I agree about the timelines issue. I think that there is effective framework in the Yukon. It's just not implemented that effectively. And so instead of respecting regulated or legislated timelines, we're on the slow track, and we just have to get back to normal track. And I think if we achieve that, we would all be much happier.
Kent?
Great. Yeah, for this one, I guess one more like inwards facing. So communication, we can do a better job. So people understand what exactly we do, what are all the steps along the way, what the expectations are. So I think we recognize that as a barrier. It's a priority now to kind of fix that. More in the broader sense, the solid approach to like data collection, assessment and consideration of cumulative effects, and just project review in general. It's a long process here in Yukon. Yeah, it's tough to motivate, and it's also tough as assessor. I've also worked for the water board, so the different ends of the spectrum or the process, knowing what either side or other parties are talking about along the way, it changes throughout a project regulatory lifespan. So having like that connection to each other throughout the whole process, I see as important, and without really having it now, it makes things difficult.
Did you say, you say consistency? I didn't hear
Connection.
you, sorry.
Just a connection.
Connection, okay, thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Kent. Will?
Drawing a blank here. The I think, as Steve alluded to earlier, when the assessors are going through a project, they do a lot of predictive modeling and stuff to come up with things. And in the plaster industry, and they use a very precautionary approach to things. And it kind of goes back to my comment before about how we are, you know, in a lot of instances, a lower risk industry than others. And maybe that precautionary approach is a little bit too high that's used on us. And yeah, sorry, I lost where I was going with that, but.
Okay, so you with the precautionary principle and how it's applied for plaster mines. And perhaps it's a bit over the top considering the risk of a plaster mine. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yes. And it just seems like every year the assessments get more and more complex, and they take longer and longer to come out of the offices, and with that too, it's become over the years, like we used to be able to do our own licenses, and now I would say probably over 90% of the industry has to resort to hiring consultants and stuff like that. So and I feel when we do that, we're losing a lot of the reality too of what actually happens on the ground, because you're trying to convey your operation to someone that's not there every day. So, you know, that's, you know, the scope creep keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the assessments get bigger and bigger, and yeah, and all that adds to timelines.
Yeah, and it's probably fair to say that there's also more pressure on practitioners and YESAT to consider more things each year. This is why it's taking longer to get a plaster mine through a screening or through an assessment. So is that fair, Kent, that there's been more and more demands put on your practitioners to make decisions and more information, more criteria, whatever? Yeah,
definitely. And even just if you look at the courts recently, there's a lot going on. So one could say it's a fascinating time to work because it's changing so fast. But to your point, all these big changes takes time first of all, for us to figure out and then move that down the system. So I definitely hear you.
So it's getting more complex. There's more information needed. There's court challenges. And EA is not easy. I mean, it's a real balancing act between what a proponent can spend on getting an application in, the timing to get through approvals, and then making decisions when you have interveners that are requiring more and more and more consideration of things you hadn't considered 5 years ago. You know, if you look at what was considered 10 years ago versus now, it's a whole different world. Pam, I'm ad-libbing here, by the way. Do you have any comments on that, Pam? Do you think that's the case? It's getting more complex because of that reason as well?
Oh, for sure. And, you know, I was in charge of the environmental assessment and permitting for the Wolverine mine back in, I think starting in 2005, so I do remember 2003. And, you know, that had a record permitting. It was a greenfield project, which there hadn't been one in the territories in some time. And it was either 36 or 37 months to go through EA and getting the quartz license and the A license. So working now with fireweed, we are planning on tripling that. And that, you know, in my working history, we're going to 3 times longer for an assessment and licensing. I'm not sure, and I know the Wolverine project is not the best example, but there are reasons beyond it besides the licensing and the EA that was done. But how are we in this, you know, triple time frame?
So this is an important theme because I showed you the UFA. And the principles in the UFA they're pretty darn good. I mean, they make sense. And so it's getting more complex, and there's more things going on, more demands on SAB, more demands on proponents, and it keeps moving on.
Steve,
Question
can I just add to that though? Like I should have prefaced that we were grandfathered under YEA because YESA wasn't in effect yet. So there's just the difference of the legislative change there.
Yeah. Yes. So the question is, I've all heard of from the Association of Engineers in Yukon, they're finding they're getting more and more burdens through their licensing process, and they've taken some things away to make it more effective. We're looking at, I think this is quite different. I'll maybe respond, then I'll ask anybody who wants to add to it. This is quite different, and I would say that this is just me, one of the reasons I think that there's more and more work being put on YESAB as an organization, and more work being put on industry as organizations is because of engagement. And I think that's positive. There's a positive side of that. Everybody is really interested in what's going on, and they're going to react to things, whether it's a water board hearing or a screening through XCOM and YESAB. There's a lot of engagement, which is positive because it's a transparent process, but it does create more work and more complexities. And the trick is, how do you manage that and achieve the balance? Because no matter what you do, somebody's going to be upset. Risk management is a very important part of it, but keep in mind you're predicting the effects of a development. And so if that prediction is based on a whole bunch of things. It could include risk assessment as well. So from the panel, other comments? Kent?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess I'll start with it's hard for us to unsee something we see. So if it's the current expectation, or if people are providing us what they're providing us, that's not going to change. That's going to take societal change to change that in a way. When evidence comes through the door, we have to consider it. If it's within the scope in our mandate, I guess, we have to work with it. I think to your comment about risk management, risk assessments, risk management, that is a very important tool. It's hard, from my experience in assessment on that phase, to have the level of detail to really rely on the risk management to use that as a mitigation at the end of our process. Can be difficult. It's definitely easier to do that during the regulatory phase when things are more of they move from conceptual to preliminary to even as-built, and sometimes you know what's actually going on. You can do a risk management argument a bit better.
Yeah, that's Pam, did you want to add to that?
Well, doesn't that then pull us back to that EA should be a planning tool? so that we solve some of those risk issues at the EA stage, so that we're in licensing. We already are thinking forward to mitigation and planning, so we've already, avoided, reduced, or controlled risks before we're even through the ESSA process.
Yeah, definitely. But I think like during the assessment process, we need the information, we need the evidence. Right now, we don't have the evidence. If we're talking about cumulative effects, we don't have every corner of it. Wetlands mapping is an issue. Like, we don't have everything we need to be able to hive off things in a collaborative way through engagement, like Steve said, to like confidently do our jobs and then promote like effective consultation at the end of the day by the Crown.
Will, do you have anything to add here at all? Okay. We have 10 minutes left. I'm going to ask the next question. So that's a nice segue into the next question, actually, given the question and what was just discussed. What ideas do you have for improvements in the assessment process in Yukon? Do you have any ideas? You've heard about the context, some of the challenges, some of the issues. What ideas do you have for improving the process, Pam?
I think capacity at YESIB is a big one. I'm sure you would agree with me on that. The cost of assessment is massive, and all of us, it scares all of us, I think is the right way to say it. I know it's hard to attract talented folks who really get excited about environmental assessment. I think it's a unique person who really dives into that. I think there's some ways that we could ensure consistency, and you've got designated offices, and you might fall in this office or this one, and assessments are done differently. I think there could be some oversight by YESIB in their head office looking at assessments when they're written, or the screening reports when they're written and almost final, to go through them and say, does this conform to our own guidance? Because I find that there's inconsistencies, and those inconsistencies, I can speak on behalf of Fireweed, have led to significant delays in some of our project plans. So that's one thing that I would like to see, is some sort of oversight so there's consistency across the designated offices.
Great idea. I can leave a list at the door for everyone's like wish list for YESIB. Yeah, that's all good. Yeah, no, it's capacity. It's not just the rest of the territory, it's also us, but that's an easy scapegoat. I think that internal process that we're working on is the first step for us to address, have a clear picture of what we're doing from start to finish, and try and ensure, confidence by the territory that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing time after time. Opportunities coming up. We're all bound by different statutes around the world, or around the territory, different legislations. A lot of change is easy to talk about. It's very hard for us to actually create change. There is a commitment by the signatories to YESA to do a review of the legislation by 2027. So that's something that excites us for opportunity. Successor legislation with the EMR, another opportunity. But I think we do have to learn to, or not learn, keep working together. So those processes actually can create change that we'll be stuck with for a while.
That's in 2027, you said? Okay. Before Will, I'll just make a comment. Pam said something earlier that's really a good one. Practitioners as an issue. I think Kent mentioned as well, practitioners. I used to manage a company called Gartner Lee, which was a national environmental company. And the hardest people to recruit are environmental practitioners. They're rare. And there's not, and so maybe a training module or something at Yukon University would be an idea for that, training practitioners. It is a skill, and it takes experience to make the judgment call, and there's a shortage of them for sure.
But Steve, if I can just add to that, I think that, we all work in specific industries, and yeah, we happen to be at geoscience right now, but I mean, there's other industries that need to go through YESIB too, and right. You can't be an expert in everything, and I always profess that I'm a generalist because I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I think it's really important that we get some of the assessors out to our project sites, and we have suggested this. I know on behalf of the chamber we've done this, because you can't understand what a diamond drill looks like and what the impact is in a clearing area that's, I don't know, 450 square meters, without actually going to that site to understand what those limited impacts are. And I heard that from you earlier, and I was reminded that that's a big part of this, is an education piece. And you know, we were talking earlier about, it's about relationships, but the only way we're gonna move through this together and make improvements is to actually work together. And we have to break down that wall of sending information into a black box and hoping it comes out on time. And there's a way to work together so we get really good assessments out of it. It's not taking corners and creating friends so you get an easy assessment. That is not what I'm trying to get at here. It's about learning so we can continue to learn and do better practice over time.
Thanks, Pam. Will, did you want to add?
I can add, but not much. Pam pretty much covered what our main issues were coming from the plaster industry as well. It's capacity and timelines and working together and communication, education, and one of that key ingredients is getting assessors out into the field and seeing the different industries and how we work. And you know, for many years now, the plaster industry's been doing mine tours, and we've been fortunate. We've had many ESSA assessors and board members out on our tours, and we've seen some positive effects from that. So I would encourage that to continue and maybe even grow more.
Yep.
And if we could, you know, have some standardized conditions in the process, in the applications too, that would help in our industry to make the applications a little bit more smoother, going through the process smoother. But yeah, kind of reiterate exactly what Pam said. We've about the same on that.
Thanks, Will. Okay, last question, and then we'll open up the floor for a few minutes for questions from the floor. So based on what you've heard, there's been a lot of context set today, challenges, issues, workloads, expertise. Based on what you've heard today, do you have any suggestions for any next steps? You had these questions before you came here today.
I know, but I think I already gave my suggestions.
So repeat them or break them down a little more simply.
Sure. I mean, I think consistency is key.
But that's not the next step.
No, but the next step is having this oversight before screening reports are issued, that it conforms to what the expectations are of the guidance or the standards that you put out.
Okay. That's a good idea. Okay.
I think, actually, I comment again on this. I think as proponents, we would never do an assessment without having guidance, some sort of mitigation. Let's just take, you know, wildlife mitigation. You know, you're not going to repeatedly fly over a herd of caribou. You know, we scope our activities inclusive of that mitigation. It's standard, and I think we have to move past that just project design mitigation is acceptable. I think the new standard is that project activities include mitigation, and that's what should be assessed, is a project activity that the proponent has already committed to that mitigation. I've been through an assessment where we proposed all the mitigation, it was removed, significant effect, mitigation added back in, and I'm like, what did that gain?
Kent.
Yeah. Who knows? Yeah, so I
And
think
it's been 2 months. 2 months.
I'll keep showing up to work every day and start reviewing. No, I'm joking. I think like it's twofold. We have to continue our internal work. There's been a lot of change at ESSA. Everyone knows it. We now have quorum at our board, which is great. It's a good time to do this exercise, and we have a very supportive board with a very clear priority to address organizational capacity. So we'll continue doing that. In the meantime, I think I quite enjoy doing, like, don't be shy. Come reach out to your local office, email me, whatever the case may be. We're people too, and we're here to chat.
Yeah, Ken said that to
You give me a lot of hope. Thank you.
Thanks.
Ken said that a few times to me, that his door's always open. So heavy on that engagement. So if you want to go talk to him, he's there for you now. Well,
Yeah, from a placer perspective, I would say again, it's timelines. We need to work on timelines, and we've got all kinds of suggestions for that, of course, but you know, a lot of them been touched on, and I think communication, education is a big one, capacity, working on that. And another one that might be maybe specific to placer is an issue that we come across quite often is like an 11th hour responses from interveners without an opportunity for the proponent to have a response from that. So if there would be some way we could look at avenues for the proponents to communicate with the assessors on the 11th hour, you know, interventions that get put in that we don't have time to respond on, I think that could help with some issues as well.
Okay, that's a good point. I'm glad you raised that. Questions from the audience? We got about, 25 seconds. A question from the audience. We'll go over a bit. Andrew, am I allowed to go over 5 minutes? 3 minutes? Okay, I'm under the gun here. Yes.
I'll stand up. So we've not met, but I've worked on the coffee project. We've been through 2 class 4s and a major mine assessment in the last 5 years. And one of the things I found after that, I was exhausted, as you said, but certainly there hasn't been any follow-up with YESA about lessons learned. And it's unclear to me, there was a lot of changes in guidance during that timeline. I think just maybe a comment, and then I'll ask a question. It'd be really good, I think, particularly on some of the more complicated assessments, whether it's a controversial placer mine or a major mine or something else, to have a bit of a lessons learned exercise on how that went. And even after the regulatory components of it, because I think we know that everything is changing on those other parts of the puzzle too. So here's my question. You touched on the legislation changes to YESA and with the new minerals legislation, but not updating the Waters Act. How do we make sure that we can achieve improvements to the current regime as the outcome? And what are we doing to ensure the success of the updated legislation across the board? So,
I think you need the Minister of Energy
panel?
Resources. May the force be with you.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone from EMR here? No, I think, yeah, there's lots of conversations to have. There's lots of parties at play. We've engaged by the successor legislation team on our thoughts on how the trickle-down effect could happen or could impact us. So we've provided our comments, and we're open to continue conversations throughout the process as it goes.
Could you do me a favor? Could you have that written down? Can you give that to me so I can take a picture of it? I'm going to provide some summary comments here for the chamber. I'd like to include those. We're out of time. I'm getting the high sign here. So thanks for participating. Thanks to the panel very much. It's never easy to stand up and do this, but they did a great job, and thanks for attending. So we're done this session.